1998. We're at the 12th Armored Division reunion of the Southwest Chapter. I'm doing a little history today with Bill Leftwich, and my name is Charlie Henson. Bill, thanks for letting us talk to you today. And first of all, we're going to start with who your parents were, family, where you grew up.
Well, I grew up in Fort Worth and Cisco and Dallas, and my parents were, my dad was D.O., went by initials, D.O. Leftwich, and my mother was Mary Wilson, and they were married in Duncan, Oklahoma. That was their hometown. My dad was on the Chickasaw Rolls, and we were living in Fort Worth, and when I was to be born, I was the second child. Mother wanted to go home and be with her mother, so we went up to Duncan, and I was born in Duncan, Oklahoma in June the 21st of 23. And then a week later, came back to Fort Worth. So she made me a Red River wetback. But I'm proud of my Chickasaw heritage. And my father was a combat veteran of World War I. And he was in agriculture. He was in, he had places on the produce market in Fort Worth and in Dallas. And he grew onions and onion plants down in the valley, down in the area called the Winter Garden near Eagle Pass in Crystal City and Carrizo Springs. And then he would raise onions in Collin County up around McKinney and Princeton. So as a teenage boy, well, from 12 on, 1935 on, I worked in the fields harvesting onions, grading onions, loading onions, throwing onions, and not eating onions. I never did eat onions till after I got married.
So did the Army save you from the onion fields?
Well, no, in a way, it didn't. I was a freshman at Texas A&M in the Horse Cavalry when Pearl Harbor came. I was 18 years old, and I had other ideas like ranching, and I was majoring in animal husbandry, and I knew that I didn't want any more farming.
So did they invite you to join the Army then?
No, at 18 they were drafting people at 22, 23, 24. I just quit and joined and asked for the cavalry. And I was thinking horses, and they were thinking tanks. And so that's what happened. I went right to Fort Knox and took basic training at Fort Knox. Painted my first mural there. There was a recreation hall for each battalion. And my CO found out that I was an artist, and he asked me if I could do a M4 tank on the wall. And I said, yeah, how big? He said, life size, and turned around and walked off. So I did that, painted it on there, and enjoyed doing it.
And is it still there? You know, have you been there? You know?
I haven't been back. I don't know.
So you were a tanker even at Fort Knox?
Fort Knox, right. I became, after I finished basic, I was cadre there, and I trained other people. And then they established, out near Elizabethtown, Kentucky, they established a place called Battle Training Detachment. And I was cadre out there on the 75 millimeter tank gunnery range, and we taught them how to hit targets out there, and also close combat, which was running from foxhole to foxhole, firing at moving targets. And I'd run along behind them and throw quarter sticks of dynamite on the ground, and then it would explode, and made it sort of realistic. And a lot of times the foxholes would be full of water from rain, and the men would just fall down beside them, and then their targets would be in front of them. And they'd be tired, and they didn't want to get up, and so I'd throw these quarter sticks of dynamite with an 8-second fuse into the water. And of course, it'd just blow anyway, so it'd blow water straight up, and then that muddy water would come down, and then they'd jump and run, and they hated me, but I got them through it.
How do you go about training a person how to shoot and run at the same time? Tell us the concept of that.
Well, you train them first to fire from all the different various positions. and then they have to just learn to adjust to be able to run and fire and try to keep their muzzle from getting dirt in it, or else their piece would blow up. But when they fall with the butt low and the muzzle high, and then they roll to position to fire, and tell them there's targets, and we had targets that would bob up and say, look to your left or look forward, and then they would try to make a sight picture as soon as possible and fire. But after they've had enough training on firing, well, then they should be able to adapt to movement and fire, but you're out of breath and no telling what the weather's like, and that's just the way it is in combat. You just have to make do regardless.
So how long did you do this training?
Oh, I was probably there 6 months, and then they froze all the cadre and said, you're going to be here till the end of the war, teaching people. They were running the graduates of West Point through there. They were running the officers' candidate school graduates through there, as well as basic training people. And I didn't want to stay there. I wanted to be in a line outfit like the 12th. And the only way you could get out would be to apply for Air Cadet and be accepted. And so I took that physical and made it. Now, previously, I'd tried Naval Air Force before I went in the Army, and my right eye wasn't 20/20. But this time, I don't know, somehow I got by it. And then after I was in the Air Force a short while, they said, we have too many candidates for pilots, so anybody that came from the ground forces is going back to the ground forces. And that was at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri. And so that suited me fine, so they sent me to Camp Barkley then to join the 12th. And since I'd asked for cavalry and volunteered, they had to put me in the cavalry. And so that's why I wound up in the 92nd, which made me happy. And so I already was a buck sergeant, so and the buck sergeant in the F Company was tank commander. And so I became a tank commander at, I guess I was 20 then.
What was it like going into Camp Barkley? I'm assuming, okay. Was the 12th already there at Barkley, or did you go in?
No, they were already there. They'd been training. They were organized at Camp Campbell, Kentucky, and they'd been on maneuvers. And they were an older division, and they were settled down, and it was a real good outfit. And when I got there, we pulled a few more little maneuvers against the 13th Armored at Camp Bowie at Brownwood, and then we passed all the requirements for overseas duty. And so I just went into a going organization.
What was it like to go in straight in and be a buck sergeant? Did that make any difference, or did you have to kind of make a place for yourself? Or?
No, it didn't make any difference. Sergeants are accepted as sergeants by the people, the corporals and privates, and by the first sergeants and officers, and they expect you to do your job, and it was no problem. I'd have 5.5 years of military when I went in at 19, and so really the Army was kind of old home week for me. I was very much at home.
Okay. So you had a lot of training. Did they train you in all the tanks? Did every person go through the whole training system, so no matter what
right.
it was, you were ready?
Yes, in basic training, you got training in your half tracks, driving half tracks, getting in and out of medium tanks, driving medium tanks, light tanks. And that was the 2 tanks we had at that time. They were working on a heavy tank, but it was impractical. It was too heavy. So the M4 and the M5 light tank were the 2 tanks that they were using.
Tell me the difference between the two. Describe those to us.
Well, the main thing is the armament. The M4 carried the 75 and then later a 90 millimeter. And the light tank carried a 37 millimeter cannon, which would not knock out a German tank. So we weren't supposed to fight German tanks. We were supposed to hit what they call thin-skinned vehicles, quarter, half-inch armament, and no more. Otherwise, run and hide, you know. And really against infantry, because we had 3 machine guns. And then we had, we could fire white phosphorus. We had white phosphorus grenades, and we had smoke, and then our cannon fired either armor piercing or a high explosive. And so if we saw a bunch of infantry off somewhere, we could throw an HE or a high explosive in among them. But the M5 light tank carried the 37, and the M4 carried the 75. And then later it got a 90, and later we got a tank called the M24, which was a very good light tank, and it had a 75. And it had a low silhouette, very fast, and it was a good tank, real good tank.
What about the thickness of the skin and stuff? Was it
Well, there's
comparable? Was
yes,
it getting a little better towards
right,
going against the Germans?
Right. The 88 would still knock out any of them, it'd go into any of them. If you got hit by an 88, you might as well abandon your tank.
You mentioned in the tank that you had smoke and you had phosphorus. Now I know. Tell us the difference of why you would use it and what the difference was.
Now, white phosphorus is a terrible thing, and if it gets on you, it'll burn right through you unless you can put mud and water on it to keep the oxygen away from it. Otherwise, it'll just burn through and drop out the bottom. And so a lot of times if we were come in among a bunch of dug-in Germans somewhere and we wanted them out of their foxholes, which we did so we could shoot them or take them prisoner, well, then I would get white phosphorus grenades and throw around their foxholes so when it would explode, it would get down in their foxholes, and then they'd want to come out and want to surrender because they were burning, they were hurting. Or if we had a man wounded and I wanted to take my tank up so the medics could pick him up, and I wanted to obscure everything from the enemy, then I would throw 3 or 4 smoke grenades and make it obscure so that the medics could come up and pick him up, or somebody could get out and put him on the tanker. So then we also had fragmentation grenades, and just like any infantryman carries, only I had a bunch. So anytime I was dismounted from my tank, I would take some fragmentation grenades and hook onto my field jacket and carry with me. And we also had concussion grenades, but I didn't care much about them. I liked the frag because they hurt people. Okay. The frag is the one that you think about that looks like a waffle, so that when it explodes, it breaks into all those pieces. That's why they have thin parts and heavy parts, and goes in all directions and up. And it's really devastating to the infantry if it's close to them. And so that's the one I like to carry.
And the other one?
And the other one was a round grenade, and it was a thin skin grenade. And like, say you had a pit with some men serving a 88 gun, and you throw a concussion grenade in there among them, well then, after it exploded, you don't have to worry about those guys. They're out of it for a while. Then you could walk in there and take all their weapons, and maybe some of them be dead, maybe some of them wouldn't, but they wouldn't be able to hear. They don't know what's going on, and it had its purpose.
So you carried all this in your tank. Now, what was your position?
I was in the turret. I was tank commander up in the turret, and then and I carried my field glasses around my neck all the time, and I was always looking for 88s so we could get behind a house or something in case they fired at us and missed. That's the only way you could live, was if they fired at you and missed, if you were the lead tank. And being in cavalry recon, well, a lot of times I was a lead tank, and I did have an 88 hit a tree by me, and I got behind the house before he could reload. I talked to my driver and I said, pull to the left, get behind that house, and not exactly those terms, but he knew what I meant, and he moved. And then they knocked a tank out behind me, and then a medium came up on the left, and they knocked it out too. But I stayed behind the house and made it okay.
Okay, when you're looking out the turret, you've got the top open.
Mm-hmm.
When you close the turret, you can still see it. What kind of visual picture do you see if you have to close the turret, and why would you close it and keep it open? Just
Okay,
tell me that
all right. I ran with my hatch open all the time and my head out, In fact, I stood up a lot so I could see the train we're coming into. And then when we got to where it looked like it was going to be bad and maybe some small arms fire, I would get down to where that I was just being able to see over the turret and to see the battlefield. Because if you go down in and then close your hatch, all you have is that one strip from your periscope. And of course, it'll turn around. And your driver and assistant driver or bow gunner who has a machine gun, that's what they're having to look at. And your gunner's over here, and his head's down, and that's what he's looking at, plus his telescope for his cannon. So really, to see the whole field, the tank commander is sort of obligated to keep his head out as long as he possibly can, unless small arms starts plunking all around him. And then you can get down, and unless there's artillery coming in above you, then you don't even have to close your hatch. And that way you can raise up and look or get down or throw a grenade or whatever you have to do. So I close my hatch very seldom. One time I had some airbursts right above me, and it's a wonder it didn't get me, but I closed my hatch after that, and no more came in, but then I opened it. But that would be the only time that I would close my hatch.
You're a pretty tall man.
Yeah, I was standing pretty tall in the turret because the light tank is small, but you have a seat that was on a spring, and you could adjust it. And so I could adjust it so that just the top part of my head would be out.
Now, that's even if you were standing, it would
Mm-hmm.
go up and down.
Yeah.
Okay.
You were always semi-standing, even if you were sleeping in your turret. You could put your feet in your bedroll and pull up and still just be sitting in your position and still see out. And we spent lots of nights that way, of course, because mud and snow on the ground, and that's better than being in the mud and snow. Although a tank itself at night is a pretty good target for bazookas and if there was any prowling around. But that was better than being down in the snow.
If you were sitting in your tank, explain to us the layout and about the distances and the size in space between your men.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There were two men down in the hull. Tanks were made in World War I in a British factory that made ships. And so they used the names, nautical terms. And so the hull is the main body of the tank. Then the turret, which revolves 360 degrees, sits down in that. Your driver and assistant driver are in the hull in front of you. And you and your gunner are up in the turret, which is a basket. And then an armored turret, and then it can rotate. And so there, I could reach down with my foot and kick my assistant driver or bow gunner on the shoulder or head if I wanted to. So we weren't far from each other. And the gun was between the gunner and myself. So I could, if I needed to, if he were asleep, I could just reach over and get hold of him. And around you, on the sides, they called sponson, you had all your shells in racks, and also your racks in the turret holding your additional grenades. And so as the turret turned and everything, all that was, you were right at home, and there was a radio behind you. And the tank commander wore headphones most of the time, and a lot of times we just put it on one ear and the other one up on our helmet, because you couldn't put both of them on and still wear a helmet. But everything was real handy. In fact, your elbows were sore a lot of times from being hit, and you're surrounded by steel. But inside is painted white, so everything shows up, and you know where everything is. And it's a good arrangement, as long as you don't get hit.
Yours was a medium tank.
No, it was a light.
It was a light.
Uh-huh. Cavalry used light tanks for recon.
Okay. Tell me the difference between a tank battalion that's a recon in just a normal tank battalion?
Okay, you said tank battalion. It's a cavalry recon squadron, and it has one company of tanks, and that was F Company, and they're light tanks. The rest of the troops are recon troops which travel in M8 armored cars. It was an armored car. You've seen pictures of it in the displays, and it has a 37 millimeter on it too. And they also had jeeps or peeps. In armored force we called them peeps, but they also had those and half tracks. And the recon troops like A, B, C, D, A, B, C, and D. F was tanks, and the E troop had a tank chassis, but its turret was different. It had a little short 75 millimeter cannon, and so that was our mobile artillery. And so they followed along behind us, and when we got in a place where we needed some firepower, artillery firepower, we could get on the line and call E troop, and then they would send in artillery for us. But recon squadron works for the division, and we're to move fast, stay in contact with the enemy, and then when we were spearheading, why then we were a lot of times assigned to try to take a bridge or something before they could blow it. And some of the regiments, like the 17th Armored Infantry Battalion, acted like recon. I mean, they made lots of miles in one day, many times, but we were usually in front of the division somewhere running, and sometimes the division even shelled villages that we had just been in, not knowing that we had already been there. But we would have to circle the tanks at night, or if we were with a troop or something, we'd have to circle, because we'd be alone ahead of 12th Armored Division, and we just had to look out for ourselves. And of course they were just pushing us, keep going east, and no maps. We'd run off the maps, so we just moved east.
What kind of mindset does that take?
Mindset?
Yeah, what kind of mindset? What kind of men were y'all that?
Oh,
frontier?
well, after you've been in combat a little bit, there's a certain amount of hate develops, and a certain amount of you get a feeling that of victory, and you know that you can't go anywhere else until this is over, and so you get determined to get it over with, and to do whatever job they ask you to do. And so we have a lot of fun along the way, just to kind of break the tension and everything, and pull tricks on each other. And my tank driver was very humorous, and I'd run up to him after getting orders to move, and I'd say, "Turn her over," which means start the engine. He'd say, "Which side do you want it on?" or something, you know. He was just humorous. But things like that keep you to where that you can handle it, and especially if you're making miles, that's good. And everybody was just pretty well cooperative about trying to get it over with and kill as many Krauts as we could.
Did y'all lose many of the 92nd? Or?
No, we were very fortunate. In our company, in the F Company, we didn't lose so many. We did some with sniper fire, like if a gunner would raise his head up, he'd maybe get killed. And we were very fortunate. We lost a few tanks, but the tanks would be hit in a place where it was behind the crew, and the crew was able to get out. And so we were very fortunate. A troop and all the other recon troops lost more men than we did. But each of our platoons would work with a certain troop, so we became very close to those men. And like I worked with A troop a lot. In the first platoon worked with A troop a lot, and when A troop would lose a man, it just as if it was one of ours. The cavalry squadron, our colonel thought he had a division, I think, the way he'd run us around. But he was a good man.
Who was
But
he? And tell me about him.
Colonel Whipple, he was a West Pointer, and he was a very good man. But we had some humorous things. Sometimes when we'd be going somewhere and we'd run onto something that was too big for us to handle, the troop commander would call back and say, Colonel Whipple, we've got something here. And he'd say, just bypass that small stuff and keep going. Not being there and not knowing. So one time he got caught. He had a half-track and armored car with him, and he got caught, and they were kind of pinned down, and he called the commander of D Troop, Dog Troop, Bartholomew, and said, Captain Bartholomew, said, get back here and get me out of this mess. And just for fun, Captain Bartholomew told him, he said, just bypass that small stuff and keep coming. And then he said, Colonel, I'll be right there. And Colonel Whipple really kind of set into his mind that he had been pushing us sometimes when he shouldn't have. And but he was a real good man. And we felt like we were an organization apart because we were always, it just never had a whole lot to do with the division itself. It seemed like we were just always scattered out somewhere, keeping the line going or something, and using our own little E troop instead of division artillery.
When you talk about readiness and heavy stuff, can you give us some examples of that? So we'll kind of know what it was like.
If you run into 188, that's heavy stuff. And we had some sergeants that were real, that took advantage of situations. One sergeant came around the curve and came up to a barn, and he thought something was kind of fishy, and he got off his tank and he walked over and he opened the barn door, and there was an 88 looking right at him. And it was just old wooden doors, just like an old barn, you know. And he just closed the doors. But the crew was around in back in a foxhole playing cards. Didn't even hear them come up. And very fortunate. But if we'd say you were trying to come over a hill or around a curve, and an 88 was there with a lot of infantry people with automatic weapons, then that was, you had to do something to eliminate him or just go somewhere else.
So were y'all mobile enough that you could kind of skirt around and miss it?
Yeah, if it wasn't real muddy, we could go off of any pavement and just go through the woods and country pretty well. But they were smart. If they had a good roadblock and everything, then they'd put mines off to the side where you would normally want to go. And so we'd have to think, where's the first place to go to get around that? And I better take the second one and go the other way, and things like that. Although we did have some people hit mines that were in armored cars and shake them up and hurt them, but not too bad. I say not too bad. It didn't happen to me, so I can't say that. But one of those guys that happened to might say, Bill, you don't know what you're talking about. It was bad.
Were you ever wounded?
No, I wasn't. I had frostbitten hands and feet, but I wasn't wounded. I was very fortunate.
What is, I've heard a lot about frostbite and stuff like that. Tell us what that's like, and how did you know that?
You didn't know it till after the war was over. You knew at the time that you were cold, and you just can't describe. Well, one time my driver thought the engine was knocking, and it really, I was kicking my foot against the side of the turret, trying to get some circulation, and he kept hearing that noise, and he thought something wrong with the engine. But your hands and feet would just get so cold that it's just hard to describe. Well, after the war, when winter would come, like if you was off on a deer hunt or something and it got below 34 degrees, your feet and your hands just turned white and hurt like the devil. So you know that you were either frozen or frostbitten at one time. And it doesn't get any better. It's just poor circulation. People are always saying change socks and your feet sweat. Never sweat.
So it damages the veins? And
Yes.
all that.
Yeah, it lowers your circulation in your extremities.
Tell me, if you were to close your eyes and you remember, there's one thing that has stuck in your mind 50, 51. What is that day? What is that moment? Do you have one time that kind of
Well, that time the 88 hit the tree behind my tank instead of hitting me. I was the lead tank, and that's when I got behind the house. So just before that happened, Sergeant Francis Towers of A Troop was laying alongside my tank, and there was small arms fire coming at us, and I didn't know there was an 88. And Sergeant Tower kind of head kind of wiggled, and I was looking out of the turret down at him, and he rolled over and took his helmet off and looked at it, and a shell had gone, a rifle bullet had gone in the front of his helmet and out the back, right near the crest. And we wore a little wool knit cap, and he had a black mark right across the top of his. And I could see it, and while he was looking at his helmet. And I said, "Sarge, that was pretty close. You better keep your head down." And he looked up at me, and there I was in the turret with my head up. He said, "What about you, you dumb Texas?" So I kind of got my head down, but about that time is when 88 hit the tree. And I didn't know it, but I was broadcasting. There's two ways. You have intercom on your mic, and then you have broadcast. And I had my switch on broadcast, and I didn't know it. And so I was talking to my driver to get him behind this house before they could reload and hit us. And the lieutenant of my platoon was back in the next village behind us. And they were all listening on the radio because they heard all this firing going on. And this lieutenant says, "I think I better call Sergeant Leftwich and tell him that he's broadcasting." And we had a communications sergeant named Jim Hanks, who everybody thought the world of, Montana boy, a personal friend of mine. And Jim said, "Lieutenant, he's busy." He says, "You just let him alone." And Lieutenant didn't say a thing. But that was a pretty hot time.
Where was that?
It was in Germany when we were spearheading across. What's the terrible kind of Limburger Hof, Limburger cheese, Limburger Hof. A Troop lost a private named Edelman that day, and we lost a tank, and then the medium tank lost their tank commander. That was in March 45.
As y'all went across, y'all, as you spearheaded, I wanted to ask you. We hear that y'all had to take everything off of your tanks when you started spearheading for Patton. But nobody's gone into details about the orders or how you found out or anything like that I know of.
Well, I've heard a lot about this business about sending a detail of men out. This new movie that's so bad about World War II, about hunting up private so-and-so. The whole concept is stupid because Army headquarters knows where the 12th Armored Division is. The commander of the 12th Armored Division knows where every battalion is, and he has contact with them. And if he wanted a certain private out of any part of that, he'd just send down word, "Send me Private so-and-so," and it would happen. You don't have to send people out. They know where you are. And so when Patton wanted us to go spearhead for him, he wanted to confuse the Germans, and so he didn't want them to know that it was a division out of the 7th Army. We went from the 7th Army to the 3rd, and so that's when they said, "Take off your 12 armored 12th Armored patches and put mud over your 12th Armored on your vehicles, so that they are confused in that they don't know that the 7th Army is now one division short and could hit them at a certain place or something. And so we were called the Mystery Division, and the Germans didn't know what division we were.
And you covered it up with mud?
Yeah, you could put mud on well, it just was painted on the front slope plate of your tank or your vehicle, and you could just put mud on it, or if somebody did happen to have some paint.
I guess I thought you did.
But mud was handy.
As you were going through, we have a girl that's doing quite a bit of research to do on the death camps, concentration camps. Did you liberate any of those, and could you?
I was with the troop that went into that one, not too far from Landsberg, and went right into it, and I would take some of those people into German homes, and I would run the Germans out and take those people down in the cellar, and the Germans had hams and all kinds of food and eggs and jars of, they call it mermelada. Of course, I was looking for jelly and preserves, and so I would take some of those, but I would give those people hams and things, and then later they'd get to fighting and arguing, come back and have me cut it in two for them or something, two of them to separate. But I had them just come up and kiss the side of my tank, and then when we had to leave, they were surrounding the tank, and they were just walking skeletons. So I had a case of sea rations on the back of my tank, and so I would take it out can at a time and throw it to have those guys chase after it, to get them away from my tank so that I could leave. And when I was leaving, two of them had caught one of the SS guards. Those people had bruises. Women, too, had bruises in their face. I mean, big purple bruises where they'd hit them with the butt of their rifle. And they told me that the Germans would throw bread down, and then when they would reach for it, then they'd kick them in the rear. And, of course, they had no flesh in their rear, and it was just bones. And they really, really hated those German guards. And when I was leaving, two of them had caught a German guard, and they were in the bar ditch over by where I was, and of course he was dead, and they had his rifle. And they were standing there grinning, and I made a mark like, "You cut this throat." And they said, "Mm-mm," all the way. And they would try to turn their rifle into us, and we'd say, "No, keep on killing Germans." And that made them happy. But it was one of the worst things I've ever seen.
It was men, women, and children.
Men and women.
Mm-hmm.
It was really bad. And some of them been there 6 years. I remember one guy saying over and over and over, 6 yardies, 6 yardies. I don't know if he was a Russian or a Belgian or what, but he was a big man. And he gave me a fleece lined coat that I gave to the museum.
So some of them had kind of warmth, or did?
He did, and the rest of them, all of them were dressed in rags, stripes, and some didn't have a shirt. That was in the spring. And they were just living skeletons. The ones that were alive, the rest of them were all laying out there like cordwood. Bad.
Were there furnaces there, or were they just? They didn't.
I don't know about that.
They were just a concentration.
They were just a concentration camp, and they probably went out there to work or did something. But the contrast is what killed me was the German houses right across the fence. I went in one. Well, they'd kissed my hand and forearm, and I went in a German house, and they have stoves with a water reservoir that gets hot. And I told them I wanted some hot water, and I just wanted to wash up real good. And there they were, rosy-cheeked and fat, and said they didn't know a thing about it. A terrible contrast.
How did the people manage the food, eating food? Did it make them sick, or were they
I'm sure that the sea rations that I gave those guys, if they didn't water it down, it would have made them sick. For a stomach that hadn't had much solid food. I didn't think about that till later, but I couldn't help it. Yeah, they were terribly hungry.
So what happened to those, y'all had to go ahead and leave?
Yeah, we were just moving. That was our order, just keep moving. So
How long were y'all there when you talk about?
Oh, I was in about an hour. My tank driver was a married man. I was 21, and he was a married man, and he got into a warehouse with a bunch of ladies' clothes, and he was giving these dresses to these Jewish prisoners, or whatever nationality they were, these women. And he just had fun doing that. He'd just hold them up and give 4 or 5, you know.
So there were even warehouses of clothes there?
Yeah. Well, the ones previous that had come in and they had killed or died or something. No telling. Well, they know how many, but it's terrible. But I don't like for anybody to ever tell me that the Holocaust did not happen. No way can people tell me that. Because what I saw was, it was a branch of one of the main ones. I don't remember which one, but it was a branch off of one of the main ones, which was just what we saw multiplied.
When you go through war and you've seen so many things already, does that prepare you for what you see there, or how does a man deal with the carnage and then go into a camp like that and see what you saw? What kind of things have happened to you where you could, or what mechanisms did you do just to be able to keep on going when you see things like this?
It just made you a little more determined to help get it over with. More determined. And hate the enemy more. At that time, I had a real good hate for the Germans. Now, I realize now that a lot of German soldiers were just put in there against their will. They had to do the job and all that. But at that time, I had hate for the whole nation. In fact, my captain asked me one time, he and I didn't get along. I was bad to go up to a German house and ask them if they had any eggs. And if they had a case of eggs, I'd just take the whole case and put it on the tank. And then we'd have fried eggs that night because my bow gunner had been a fry cook, and he was good. And eggs were a real luxury to us after C&K rations. So about the day the war was over, we were in a German town, and I was frying a bunch of eggs on a griddle in this German house. And the captain, the orders had come down from Eisenhower not take any more food from the Germans because they were going to face a tough winter, and I could care less. And this captain stuck his head in the door, and he saw me with all these eggs. He said, "Where'd you get those eggs?" And I said, little German lady run up to me and said, "Soldier, I want you to have these eggs." And of course, he knew that she didn't, and I knew it, but he just shook his head, and he said, Sergeant Leftwich said, "If you could push a button and kill all the German people, would you do it?" And I said, "Show it to me." And he just turned and walked off. But he and I never did get along good. We had different attitudes about things.
How would this be different?
He wasn't as mean as I was, I guess. And for a lot of reasons. He was one of these guys that was behind the troops. Now, some of the people may not like me saying that, but he would send you out, but I never saw him come on over the hill where the action was.
So seeing action makes you think that when you think it
Yeah.
requires a different kind of person.
Yes, I had some German prisoners one time with their hands in the air, and it was kind of cold day. But it was the day after I'd been in that prison camp, and the captain hadn't seen it. Well, he came along, told the prisoners put their hands down and warm their hands. And I had them up for a reason, which was to punish them. And so I came up just as he was telling them to put their hands down. I said, if you'd been with me yesterday, you wouldn't say that. And he didn't understand what I was talking about. But his order stood.
Has that experience made you any different? Are you different now because of what you saw and did in the war?
Well, I don't know what I could be, I started in ROTC at 13, and I started studying war before that. Somehow or another, I just knew I was going to be in a war. My dad had been in a war, and I just knew that I was going to be in a war. And of course, by 38, 39, anybody that read newspapers knew that we were going to be in a war. And so I was mentally accepted that I was going to be in a war. So it really didn't change my life a whole lot from what I had planned. And then I don't know what I'd been like any different if I hadn't have been in it. I don't know. Probably not too much different.
Tell me about getting to the Rhine.
Well, our division commander, Roderick R. Allen, Major General Roderick R. Allen, had worked with Patton in Africa. He was a man that knew combat. He had been in the Army since 1915. He was A&M class of 15, and he had stayed in all his life. And Patton was riding him pretty hard to get his division on up to the Rhine. And of course, he had, in turn, had to ride us. And so we did a lot of day and night movement, just get wore out and get a little bit of rest and then keep moving. And it was, as long as you're moving like that and you keep them off balance, why, it's a pretty good situation. But it was hard on you physically. But at 21, it didn't seem to matter.
You just now mentioned that you had to keep moving to keep them off balance. Talk about the theory of that, the battle, the theory of that battle. And that
Okay, that's one thing cavalry is for. And of course, Patton was a cavalry man. And what they found out during the Civil War, that cavalry attacks that are unexpected and then break through the lines and then get in behind the lines, then that really unnerves your enemy. And so that's what we were trying to do. And when you get them off balance like that, well, then they can't set up good defenses and stop you at certain places. So you just want to keep rolling all you can. And of course, that's the armored force, their motto, in order to not ever have a stalemate like trench warfare like World War I, was just to keep rolling. Don't worry about your flanks right now. Think about that later. Which you have to sooner or later. So moving was really our important thing. Movement.
If that is true, what would have happened if you didn't move?
You'd become a stalemate then. You'd pull up your big guns against their big guns, and then you would have a situation similar to World War I, which you don't want, because you just, through attrition, you lose a lot of people that way.
Did you feel a victory when you went up to the Rhine? When you got there?
Well, you bet. Yeah, we knew. As soon as we got over in Germany, we knew it was the beginning of the end, and just a matter of time, and just hope you made it. That's all. Yeah, it was obvious to us and to them too. Their prisoners were very happy when they gave up, usually, unless it was SS. But usually their prisoners were happy to get some of our cigarettes and food and know the war was over for them.
Tell me about the SS troops.
SS troops were very, very good troops, and they were mean. The SS troops are the ones that slaughtered a bunch of our people in Malmedy and just lined an artillery outfit up in the snow and shot them down. And we don't like to talk about it, but a lot of times after that happened and we took SS as prisoners, we really didn't take them prisoner. They got hurt before they got to the rear somehow or another.
Did you ever fight against them?
Yes, not knowing at the time, but we'd take some that were prisoners. They'd take their collar ornament off, which was a skull and crossbone, but if it'd been on there any while, it left the imprint on their uniform. And they also had their blood type tattooed under their left arm. A lot of people don't know that, but if you had a person that was dressed in a regular Wehrmacht uniform and you thought he was SS, you could make him take his shirt off and look under his left armpit, and if there was a tattoo there, that's his blood type. Then he was SS.
Why did they do that?
Yeah, well, that was, it was an elite outfit, and in case he didn't have his dog tags, then the medic was working on him. He could just look and see what his blood type was. I can't explain why the Germans did a lot of things, but that was one way of telling an SS if he was trying to fool you.
Okay, where did you as the 92nd go after the Ryan?
We went back to the 7th Army, and then they ran us down through kind of southeastern through Germany, past Munich, and down into towns. There was, real funny, is one town called Bad Aibling, A-B-L-I-N-G. And of course, having been at Barclay, we called it Bad Abilene. And ran on into Austria. On the 1st of March of 45, we were right on the Austrian border, and the Alps were right in front of us, beautiful. And it snowed 12 inches. But it wasn't a cold like the other cold during the winter. And we didn't go into Austria very far at all. The 36th Infantry, Texas National Guard, was following us. And since they were infantry, they had us pull over and said, we got it over the radio, pull your tanks off the road and let the 36th Infantry come through. 2 days later, they captured Hermann Goering, the big, fat Air Force man. But we pulled over, and knowing it's a Texas outfit and the infantry and everything, I thought, this is going to be great. And I was just sitting up on my turret, and we'd probably made coffee with our little pump-up stove, and drinking coffee out of our canteen cup. And I was anxious to see the infantry come walking by. Well, they didn't walk by. They had commandeered every civilian vehicle. There wasn't a one walking. The first one was a touring car. And now, see, they didn't have any fuel, so they had to have an outfit on the back that they could build a fire and make steam. And it looked like a big hot water heater sticking up on the back of this car, and a fire back there, and they'd have to feed wood into it. And these infantry GIs was laying around, had their feet up over the side. They knew the war was right over, May 1. And the one that was driving had on a black top hat like Lincoln wore, and big cigars, and their M1 sticking up. And I just nearly fell off my tank laughing, because here's the 36th Infantry, and they were, every one mounted on some civilian vehicle. It was funny. It was a good way to end it.
As we go through this, would you tell us tell me a little more about, talk to me about some other actions that you faced.
Well, at various times, at the time, I didn't know what a Panzerfaust was. It's a 155 warhead on a long metal tube, and it fits in another tube, and it has a charge. It's kind of like a bazooka, only it doesn't go straight. It goes in a big arch. And we came up to a roadblock one time, and I heard one of those things go off and saw it coming through the air. And I was just mesmerized by it. I didn't know what it was. And I had some D troopers on the back of my tank. And this thing was just coming right at me and went over my head. I don't know if I'd have ducked or not, and it missed my tank, but it blew up behind it, and the back of my tank raised up, and of course those D troopers left me. And then they fired another one, and it hit on the right side of my tank, and the other one on the left side of the tank. And then, of course, we opened up, and they didn't fire anymore. But I learned about Panzerfaust that day, and those things are pretty bad if they hit you. But I was just lucky; they just overshot all times.
Where were you the day that you found out the war was over?
They had pulled us back into Germany out of Austria, and we had a fellow named Black in A Troop from Mexico, a volunteer that came out of Mexico, and he was a Mexican, but he had an English name. I guess his daddy was a gringo, and he was accidentally killed by a 50 caliber getting in and out of a scout car or something, and I don't even know what town we were in. One thing I do remember vividly was April the 12th when we got word that Roosevelt had died. And we were on the side of a forested mountain and on a little muddy road, and it had been raining and rained all night. And Germans were on a ridge above us, and they were just sniping at us off and on, not bad. But we spent the night in we dismounted one of our machine guns and had it set up going up the hill and tried to put a tarp around, and it rained. It wasn't a real cold rain, but it was bad enough, but it just rained all night. But I'll never will forget that April the 12th, because we had word that Roosevelt had died. And of course that hurt everybody that he had died at the helm, so to speak. Didn't even know who the vice president was at that time.
What was it? Talk a little bit about that, what Roosevelt meant.
Well, he was just kind of the overall leader and the president of the United States, but we weren't too concerned because we thought more Army than we did civilian, and we knew that the Army was in good shape with Patton and Ike and General Patch and people like that. So it didn't make us think that we had a dangerous loss or anything. Just to lose the president was bad enough.
What characteristics did good leaders have? Whether it was Ike or Patton, or whether it was closer to you, what characteristics of the man made him a good leader? Who did you respect?
Oh, I had a very good platoon sergeant. He was very stable. He didn't don't lose her head, and dependable. If you have that, and if they're concerned about their people under them, then you'll take care of them. We had a very humorous thing happen with Sergeant Godley that some people ought to hear. It'll die with me if I don't tell it, so I'll tell it. He was from North Carolina. We had been talking over the radio and using a lot of GI slang, and our captain called us together one time before we were going to go up on a little mission over a hill, and we didn't know what was over that hill, but there's a lot of Germans. But he chewed us out about using this GI slang on the radio. He said, I want you to know that enemy does are supposed to be called enemy does, not Krauts, and just quit using this GI slang like you've been using, and use correct military radio procedure. And so we all heard that little speech, and then we got in our tanks and went up over this hill, and the captain stayed behind. But when we got over the hill, there was a lot of German infantry there, and they jumped up and they were firing at us, and then they were running. And so I just opened up with my machine gun and was having a field day. And captain said, called Sergeant Godley and said, Sergeant Godley, what do you see? What do you see? And Godley was excited, and he grabbed his mic and he said, Buku Kraut, which we just had this terrible lecture about that, but the captain never said any more about it. Just things like that, though, kept you going. It was real humorous.
If you were to think about over your experiences, was the war what you expected it to be? I mean, you had studied war and stuff like that.
Yes.
It was like.
Yes. Just nothing surprised me. Not even the terrible camps. I guess I'd seen every photograph been taken in World War I in books and libraries as a kid, and I wasn't surprised about anything.
Do you think it made a difference between you who had studied and looked and seen? Were there differences between you and those other men that had never seen them?
There were. They did their job, and that was it. And I had a better concept of quite a few things that they didn't have concept of and didn't care about, and all they wanted was just to go home. And I wasn't that concerned about getting home. But we just had different concepts of things.
I think you're the first one who I've ever heard that you weren't that concerned about going home.
Well, I was young and single and didn't leave anybody at home except my family. And I just felt like I was, it was my time, you know. I'd anticipated it, and I felt like that's what I was for.
As you think about the men who didn't do very well or didn't, I don't know, emotionally or something like that, and you perceived those men, what was the difference between those who didn't survive? Maybe who didn't, there's some that did not survive it physically, but there are men who didn't do very well emotionally and psychologically either. As you look at those differences, can you kind of tell us what the difference was?
Well, I think a person that is steeped in the history of the United States and what it took to make the United States, what it took during the Civil War, the Indian Wars, the war with Spain, World War I, people that knew the history and things like that, they could handle it mentally much better than people that cared less about history. And all they knew was just their neighborhood, their factory, or whatever the work they had done and everything. Then they couldn't handle it mentally as well as a person that had a kind of a big picture of the whole world and how things have evolved. A person that really knows more about his country is more mentally equipped to handle it. I think they found that out in Korea, that the people that were educated and had a history background handled their being a prisoner of war much better than people that didn't.
What about replacements?
We got some replacements that were good young men. They were 18, 19 years old, and they were, of course, they were green, but they were good men. Enjoyed having them, and some of them come to the meetings, and we became good friends. We kind of just took them over and would help look after them, and some of them still show appreciation for that.
What is the difference? I've heard other men say who've been in the infantry battalions, that after a while you didn't want to get to know those civilians.
Yes, it's a defense method, because you hate to lose any American GI, especially one that's close to you. So you try not to get too close to them. Seeing lots of German dead and really tore up bad by artillery or whatever, just left me kind of cool. I mean, it didn't bother me a bit. But if I saw one American GI, that hurt me.
Did you ever change, did you always stay with the small tanks, or did you change, did you move?
No.
You always stayed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How did y'all deal with going fast and supplies and ammunition, and how did they deal with that?
Sometimes when we were spearheading, I heard this happen behind us, and we didn't know, but as long as a truck would come to us with these 5-gallon gasoline tanks, we'd get a bunch of those put on the back of our tank, put a nozzle on them. But I heard that they had to fly those on C-47s in behind us and land on highways and unload, because we had gotten so far from supply. And gasoline and ammo is what you want to keep armored people plenty of, and then they can keep going. So all that was happening behind us, and we didn't know it. But I had a cousin that was in one of those C-47s doing that, and he was telling me about it. And I didn't realize it had happened until you later read the whole picture. All we knew was just what was right in front of us and over the next hill and whatever we run into. We didn't know what's going on 5 miles this way or 5 miles that way or 10 miles behind.
Tell me about, all your men stayed with you the whole time. You didn't have anybody that was hurt?
No, I didn't. I had a gunner that was promoted to a tank commander when one of the other tank commanders was wounded. He was such a good man that I recommended him. And then I got another gunner, and I got a Mexican boy from El Paso, Federico Rosales, very good. Didn't get scared. One time we were in a fight, and he was doing pretty good and shooting, and he looked over at me and said, "How am I doing, Sarge?" Just that he was cool, real good man. And my other gunner that made sergeant made a real good tank commander. And I changed drivers one time. I got a driver from Oklahoma that he and I got along better than the one from Long Island, New York. But a division like that was made up of draftees, you had people from everywhere, as you can tell by the people you've interviewed. A lot of good people from everywhere. But no, none of my crew were hurt. None of them were. We were very fortunate.
Tell me some more of your stories that you like to tell your wife. Some of your favorite stories you like to tell your wife or your grandkids.
Well, there's one story going over. We were on a Liberty ship, and we had a boy named Pat Patterson from North Carolina. Now, when I say country, I mean country. And he had very little concept of the whole world and what had happened before in 1914 and all that. And he knew plowing with a mule back in Carolina, and that's about it. And we were on this deck of the Liberty ship going over, and there were little destroyer escorts working outside, and every once in a while they'd drop ash cans or depth charges if they had a sonar contact. And so this boy got pretty concerned, this Pat, and he came up to me, and of course my name in those days was Tex because I was from Texas. And I was sharpening a knife that I'd gotten out of Mexico, and I was just doing something. And he sat down beside me, and I could tell something was on his mind. And my bow gunner was an old man, 31 years old, sitting on my left, and he was from Albuquerque and had been in prison for murder and was a tough hombre. And this Patterson said, Tex, he said, I'm kind of worried. And I said, what's the matter, Pat? And he said, you reckon any of them old water rooters are going to come up here and get us? And I knew he meant subs. And I just caught myself, and I said, no, Pat. I said, you see those little ships out there that are running around and going faster than we are? Yeah, he said, I see them. I said, they've got something that they can listen to, and if they hear one of them, they'll drop a depth charge on them, and they won't get us. Don't you worry about that. And he just smiled, said, okay, and got up and walked off. And I thought, man, I hope we don't get torpedoed. Because he was mentally okay then. But his terminology just broke us out. And when he left, this guy turned to me from New Mexico and said, what's he talking about? Water rooters. I said, well, that's a submarine. But there was little things like that I'm writing down for my children and grandchildren. And so I try to remember the humorous things.
What was it like when you landed? When y'all landed?
Oh, it was interesting. We landed in Bristol, England, and the little old trains had a little high toot to their whistle, and they looked like toys compared to our trains. And they took us to Tidworth Barracks and put us in tents, and of course it was interesting to see England. And then when we got our tanks, we did some maneuvering around with our tanks in England, and one evening we came up and there was a Stonehenge. And I just stopped my tank, and it's just before sundown. And I said, say, fellas, look at there. I said, there is the Stonehenge. And all of them turned and says, what's that? So I kind of explained to them as well as I could. But we enjoyed England, and of course, we get in fights with English soldiers at various times, but right, especially when the war was over. When the war was going on, they were tickled we were there. But it was fun to see England, and we got to see the Salisbury Cathedral. We weren't far from it, and the Salisbury Plain, and it was very historical and interesting and worthwhile. But we enjoyed being in England that short while, and we lived in tents, and then we went down to Southampton and got into LCTs, the flat bottom landing craft for tanks. Went across the channel, took 5 days. I guess that getting so many in and out, it's not too far, but we were on that little critter 5 days. If I remember right, I think it was.
You probably didn't care where you were going as long as you landed.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, they rocked quite a bit.
When was y'all disembarked, and how long was it before you saw your first action, or did they send y'all out?
No, we pulled some patrols. See, there was a lot of Germans. There was about 30,000 on the Shetland Islands, or Guernsey, and they would raid the coast. And so we pulled patrols. When we first got our tanks and we're getting them cosmoline and cleaning them up and getting them ready to operate, we were pulling patrols up and down that coast, especially in the evening when the Germans would raid, hoping that we'd run onto some of them. But we didn't. And there was some controversy in Army headquarters as to which army we were going to. First they thought that we'd send them to one and then another. Then finally they made up their mind, and then they sent us to the 7th Army. And when they did, well, then we had a direction to go, and they ran us day and night until we got up to the front near Nancy, France.
Were you a part of Hershey?
Yes,
Tell me about
everybody was. I didn't get into the town itself like the tank battalions and the infantry did. They put us on a canal, and it had frozen over. It was cold, cold. And our tanks were just like every 40 feet or something, we'd put a tank. And then we'd dismount, and at night there would be flares and German patrols, and we, my little platoon had it pretty easy at Herlisheim other than being cold. We did not go into town and get involved with the German anti-tank weapons and 88s.
Did y'all, how long did it take y'all to realize what was happening and how bad it was?
Well, after the 43rd got shot up so bad, then we realized there was more. Our intelligence had told us that there was a half of division there, and it was really 2.5 divisions, or maybe even more. And it was their last attempt. After the Bulge had failed, they decided to come south, and that was their attempt to come south, and the 12th stopped it. And then they put 36 up to help us and took over, and their attack had been blunted, and so that was their last big effort to try to come in through our lines. The 36 was very cool. It was nice to see them come in. They had on white capes, and their helmets were white. And they moved in front of us and dug in snow and set up machine guns. Then that evening, just before dark, the Germans attacked and didn't know about the 36. And they waited and waited and let them get right on them. And then they cut them down. They did a great job. 36 was they had lots of combat, and they were a very good division. And the big attack that was broken up against us with armor was broken up by some P-47s. They were coming across a field, and my captain had taken me and Sergeant Folletto, who later was a lieutenant, up into a third-story building, and he said, "See that field on the other side of the canal?" And we said yes, and he said, "I want to know what's out there." Well, I could look and see there wasn't anything there, but there was a forest on the other side, and there could be anything in that forest. And he said, "I want you to run across that bridge and just take you and your driver in your tank," because he didn't think we'd get back, "and just make a big circle out there and come back." And it was a dumb stunt. And Sergeant Folletto, "You go this way and make a circle and come back." And so we'd just been sitting ducks for an 88. Well, while we were up there talking, the Germans attacked across that field with tanks and infantry behind them. And some of the tanks they had were our M4s as well as some German tanks. And he said, "Forget that order." And so, of course, I was tickled to death to forget it. But some P-47s came down, and they had 500-pound bombs on each wing, and they would just come straight down through the fire from the Germans and drop those 500-pound bombs. And they broke up that attack, and the Germans pulled back and lost a lot of vehicles. We couldn't stop them. It was a great thing to see those P-47s operate like that. Those were gutsy people. Because you can't imagine that for all the tracers you see, there's two that you don't see. You see every third's a tracer. And it was just, they were just going right down through all those tracers. And they made it fine. But they sure broke that attack up. Then that afternoon is when the 36 came in and helped wind it up.
What kind of, when you talk about 500-pound bombs, what are you talking about, devastation-wise?
It's about 4 feet long, but It just depends on what it hits. Whatever it hits, it's going to tear up. And anything 40 or 50 feet on either side of it. Yeah, the concussion probably terrible for the infantry, but they were really trying to knock out the German armor, which was leading the attack. And they did break it up. They were good. I like to tell the Air Force that I felt like that they were our allies, but I get more specific and tell them about that one time and how much I appreciated them.
Did y'all have much air?
Not too much. Tactical Air Force is what you're referring to, I believe. Not, of course, bombers had missions to bomb other places, but every once in a while, the 12th Tactical Air Force, they had red spinners on their front of their props, P-47s. Every once in a while, when we were spearheading, is the only time we saw them. But maybe there'd be a German column somewhere ahead of us, and we could just barely see them, and these guys would come over us. We had fluorescent panels on the back of our tanks, orange or fuchsia color, and for certain days you put the orange up or the fuchsia, and then they'd know not to strafe you. Well, they'd strafe right ahead of us and just shoot up those German columns and just help us immensely. And so we thought the world of them. They were good. But we didn't have radio contact to call in airstrikes like they did in Nam and Korea. As far as I know, no one ever did that. They just happened to find targets of opportunity at the right time to help us. But there should be better coordination, and we have it now, but we didn't then. Well, see, we could have had that in Desert Storm, because most of the vehicles we lost in Desert Storm was friendly fire from choppers. And it'd be a U.S. vehicle out there, and the chopper come up behind it and hit it. Well, if they'd had some kind of identification, they wouldn't have shot that Allied vehicle. And they had to resort to panels during Desert Storm, when this is the age of electronics, and each friendly vehicle ought to be giving off numbers that you realize that it's, but they didn't. And so we lost some good people during Desert Storm from our own fire.
Was that a big problem in the friendly fire?
Yes, it was. We lost Lieutenant General McNair at St. Lo and a bunch of his staff, because the Air Force that were bombing, the wind moved the smoke over onto where our troops were, and the 3rd Armored Division got bombed by the United States Air Force, and we lost a lot of people. And sometimes artillery would come in short and killed some of our own people. So it's bad to die from friendly fire, is the term is. But that didn't happen too much. But the Air Force was, sometimes they had a Pathfinder that had the Norden bomb sight, and when he'd drop his bombs, the squadrons behind him, instead of waiting until they got to that point, they'd drop their bombs and then turn. Well, they might drop their bombs on the Allies. They did that in Italy at Mount Cassino and other places. But they don't want to talk about that.
After Herlesheim, what was your next orders?
I would.
Or
I think we went to Colmar. I would have to look at the squadron history, but I think we went down to stop the Colmar pocket. That was the last part of France that was held by the Germans. And it was kind of a political move to placate the French, and the French had developed their army, and they had a real good commander, General Leclerc. I'm not pronouncing it right, but that's really not his name either, but they put quite a few U.S. divisions under him. And so that made us, after the war, they sent us medals, Veteran of the French First Army medals, because we helped at Colmar. And that was a psychological thing for the French, to have the Germans out of France altogether.
Is there anything that stands out to you in that experience around the Colmar?
No, not too much, except I saw that the 28th Infantry Division did a good job where they were working. We came in right behind them, and there was a lot of dead Krauts everywhere. And we thought a lot of the 28th Infantry Division, which was Pennsylvania National Guard, and it has the central block of an arch that comes up to hold an arch. The last block you put in, that was their shoulder patch. And it was red, and they called it the bucket of blood, but they were a good division. And of course, we worked with 3rd Infantry down there. 3rd Infantry was one of the best infantry divisions in the war. And Audie Murphy was in the 15th Regiment of the 3rd Infantry. And I got to take a shower, first shower I had in a couple of months, in their, they had a trailer with tarps on it, and shower stalls on either side down a central aisle, and plumbing with hot water. And you just take your uniform off, strip, and then go in and go into one, and a sergeant had a watch, and he'd say soap up, and about a minute later he'd say rinse off, get out, and I mean get out. And then they'd give you a new uniform on the other end, and keep your same boots if you wanted to, and field jacket. And I didn't have a 12th Armored patch on, so I got through as a 3rd Division man. But it's the first good shower I'd had. I appreciated that.
That is so weird that y'all had to go so long and just be so.
Well, we could bathe in, we could heat a canteen cup of water and pour it in our helmet. Like you say, you're in a French barn, and it's maybe 10 below outside. And you pour your hot water in your helmet, and then you strip from the waist up and bathe right quick, and then put it back on, then strip from the waist down and bathe. And then if you had some left, well, you could shave. But that was the way we bathed, to keep somewhat clean. But to completely strip off and get in a hot shower, that was, man, that was wonderful. I appreciated the 3rd Division for that. But all the GI really needed was just his helmet and a canteen cup and some hot water. Well, we had a little pump-up stove in our vehicles, and we could heat a canteen cup of water like that. Of course, we did that to make instant coffee. I guess it was Nescafe, or the forerunner of Nescafe.
Tell us about the kinds of sea rations and foods and stuff that you carried with you.
Well, you carried 2 kinds, sea rations or K. And K were in a little box. And you could open it up, and it had a little can in there, and that can might have eggs and chip bacon. And then you had to get a little screw and a little key and open it up. And it had some crackers, and it had some toilet paper, and it had a little package of cigarettes and a little chocolate bar. And that was in a K ration. Now, C rations might be beef stew, and the whole can is beef stew. And when you take the lid off, you see a lot of grease there on the top and everything, but that's all right. And then you would add that with water if you could, or just heat it over fire, and just take a spoon. I picked up a silver spoon out of some German house and just stuck it down in my boot. And then when I'd eat, I'd just grab that and then...
How did y'all carry, I mean, how much did y'all get at one time, and how did you carry it? Like, did you get a week's supply of food, or days?
Well, it was undetermined. You just have maybe a case of K and a case of C on the back of your tank, and then you just use it as you need it. And sometime maybe the kitchen truck might catch up with us, which was pretty rare. And if they did, well, then the cooks would actually fix, like in the morning, hot cakes, and of course that was just like being in heaven, you know, to have hot cakes, or the dried eggs and whatever they would fix. But that was so much better than eating C or K. But it didn't matter that much. But then when we got over into Germany, in France, the Germans had really gleaned France. And so we didn't take any food from the French at all. But when we got over in Germany, we didn't mind killing chickens or ducks, and getting their eggs or whatever we wanted to help vary our diet and keep it from being just plain old C rations or K. But when you were moving, I noticed that after you had a little firefight or some action, that all of a sudden you'd be hungry. So then we'd just open some K rations and still moving and go ahead and just eat.
I have heard a lot of stories about how people love the wine of France and Germany. But I haven't heard you mention that.
Well, I didn't drink, and I learned to drink there. I mean, you know, I thought, what does it matter? I may be dead tomorrow. But I've been kind of in athletics. I never was heavy enough to play football, but I've been in boxing and different things, and swimming. And my bow gunner, this older man, he would pick up things like that. And one time I looked in the back of his seat, and there is a trap door in the floor in case that we got knocked out and we need to escape the tank without being exposed to enemy fire. You could drop that trap door and go down and out of the tank and crawl off. Well, he had so much bottles back there, we had never been able to get out. But he was a connoisseur, and we drank cognac and wine when we'd run across it, but pass it all around to everybody, and so nobody really got affected by it much.
Well, I guess if you're driving all the time and you're in a tank, you don't need to drink.
No, that's right. Right near the end of the war, he got to where he was drinking a little too much, and I had to get a little hard with him on that.
Well, I've been told that was an escape.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and also it on a real cold day, if some French ladies came out at Colmar and gave us some glasses, like water glasses, full of this purple liquid with foam on the top, and I didn't know what it was, but it was hot, and so we drank. It was wine they had heated, and boy, it warmed us up. But 30 minutes later, we were cold. But it was good at the time. And they came out in the cold with a tray and gave everybody in 2 or 3 different tanks that hot wine.
As y'all went across France, long as it happened in Germany, but did the citizens welcome y'all, like Colmar, the people in Colmar?
Oh, yeah, French people did. They were very appreciative. And I can talk to French people today, and they'll say, "You were there?" And I'll say, "Yeah." And they say, "Oh, thank you." Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were. Some of them that had been battered, like around the coast, Battleship, Texas, had battered a lot of villages and around, trying to knock out Germans. And some of those people that had been under a lot of bombardment probably were a little bitter, but they were all glad to get rid of the Les Boches. Les Boches, that's what they call them out of the First World War, and the French still call them that, B-O-C-H-E. It's a French word for the German, and I can't even translate. I don't know what it means, but it ain't good. One little village we were staying in, I'd get my crew billeted in a French house if I could, to keep from being sleeping in a tank or on the ground. And so this old Frenchman took us in, and he was bemoaning the fact that he had no wood for the winter. And as we came into that town, the Germans had blown every tree that was alongside the road and those big trees were laying across as a roadblock. So I took my tank down and took the cable off and put it around a tree, and it was this big around and probably 50 feet long, and drug it through the village right up to his yard, and he could just hack on it all winter. Tickled him to death. But it didn't cost me anything.
Well, did y'all speak French, or did somebody around y'all?
I used Spanish and started learning French, but they could understand with Spanish pretty well. And then I learned to say, like 4 soldiers, I say quatre soldats, American, dormir, duerme, and I get French and Spanish mixed up. But I was beginning to learn French, and then we got over into Germany, and then that was it. Had to start with Kraut. And what we knew as German was just hands up and come in and what's your name, how many soldiers, and things like military stuff's all we knew in German. And we'd been taught that before we left the States. And of course we mispronounced it terribly. But they understood. If you told them Hände hoch, that means hands up, you know, and kommen Sie her, and then we'd add some other adjectives to it, and they understood.
As you look through, as you think about your war experiences, and you said you've written some things down for the children and grandchildren, I always like to ask before we end, if you would want to tell, if you would want to say something to your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, any children that would ever watch this through the years, is there one message that you would like to tell them, or something that you learned about the war that you would want to leave with them as a legacy?
Well, I guess the most outstanding thing of World War II, and now I'm looking back, you know, and at the time it might not have soaked in good, but it was when I look at the Marines in the Pacific and the Navy and all they did, and the Army, Air Force, and the Army and all they did and everything, and it's just the determination of the American civilian who became a military person to defeat the enemies of the United States. And even though it was going to cost them their lives, they would go ahead and go over the top, so to speak. And the fact that just hard to beat people like that. And their love of country should magnify our love of country, knowing that they gave their life for what they believed in. The eagerness of the young men of the United States to do the job really impressed me a whole lot. And then I can look back and read about World War I and Spanish-American War, and I see that same feeling there. Something we need to keep, and I think we have.
Let's get you out of the Army. Tell us about the end of the war and how you got home, and then kind of a little bit of what you've done with the rest of your life.
Okay. Well, I came home on an aircraft carrier. It's called the Lake Champlain, and of course those were happy days, and I was thrilled to anticipate seeing the Statue of Liberty, and it was foggy when I came in. I didn't get to see it, but that was all right.
Now, did you have enough points at the end of the war to come on home?
No, I had to wait a few months.
A few months, okay.
Yeah, and pulled some occupation duty in Germany, and they opened up 2 universities, American universities, one in England and one on the Riviera, and I put in for it, and I got the one in England. And so I went back to England and went 1 semester there, and then should have come home in December of '45. But the WASP came over, and we were coming home on that, and it was damaged in a storm and had to go in dry dock. And so I didn't get to come home till January of 46. And was discharged at Camp Fannin at Tyler, and went right into agriculture. I've been sending money home and had my dad invested in agriculture for me in different crops. And well, I thought it was going to be in cattle, but he had put it in some crops. And so I had to work at that a while and get my money out of that. And then Mary Alice and I got married in 47, and I had 2 tractors and a pickup and some equipment. And we farmed and had a droughty period and lost everything. And then opportunity came along in 49 to go to Mexico on the Foot and Mouth Commission. They had an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in Mexico, and if you could talk Spanish and had worked cattle, they'd take you. And so I signed up and went for there 2 years in southern Mexico. And when we came out, I realized that I had the GI Bill, and so I went back to A&M and finally graduated A&M in 54. Well, I should have graduated in 45, but Mary Alice tells everybody I'm just slow. Then we worked in raising cattle and had some droughty periods there, and the price would drop, and I lost money again and wound up in Soil Conservation Service at Pecos, Texas. And then later we moved to New Mexico, and I worked for the Department of Defense at Holloman Air Force Base. I waltzed in there and asked them what they had open, and they said, "We've got one job open, and that's all." And I said, "What is it?" And they said, "A draftsman." And I said, "I'm a draftsman." And so I got the job, and then later I became chief draftsman. And then the base agronomist was a World War I veteran and a very good friend of mine. And he said, "Why don't you apply for this job?" And it was 2 grades higher than what I was. And he said, "Let me see your transcript and see if you have enough agronomy." And I had 20 hours. And so he said, "Yeah, you." And so I applied for it and got it. But I had to learn landscape design. And so I just studied at night and learned landscape design. So I did a lot of landscape design at Holloman Air Force Base. And then the general found out I was an artist, and he had me make a Western stag bar for the flying officers. And of course, I had a lot of fun doing that. And he had a bunch of barracks for the enlisted men that were a pea green color. And he said, "Leftwich, what do you want to do with this base?" And I said, "I'd like to change the color of those barracks." And he said, "What?" And I said, "Pastels, various pastel colors." He thought a minute and said, "Well, just get with it." So he and I had good relations, and so I had a lot of fun. I did a lot of desert landscaping on the base when we didn't have any money to buy plants, and I just had a ball doing all kinds of things there. Then I went over to Lubbock to get Dr. K to speak to the high school kids in Ruidoso, New Mexico, and he talked to me quite a bit, and then they hired me to head up their Department of Publicity. And then I wound up as landscape design, preliminary building design, over the printing office. I had about 8 jobs, and then I had a heart attack. And I decided if I was going to ever be a freelance artist at 50 years old, I better quit. And so I quit LCC in 75 and started freelance artwork and went into Western art altogether and sculpting. And then in 79, we moved to Fort Davis and built an adobe home and gallery and studio 1 mile out of town, and have lived there ever since and don't intend to move and really enjoy it. And my wife went to school with our girls in college at LCC and became a school teacher. And so she carried me through those years when I wasn't selling very much art. And then before she retired, I got to where I was doing pretty good with my art. And we've just been real happy at Fort Davis.
Tell us about your children.
Have 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. The oldest one graduated from A&M, was in airborne and military intelligence, and now he has his own business in Rio Rancho, or part of Albuquerque, New Mexico, in environmental work. He gets permits for companies that want to start mines, and he knows how to do all that surveying before they can get a permit from the state or the federal government. And he has his own business there. The next one is a girl. She's a housewife, has 4 children that are all grown now, and she lives in near Missoula, Montana, in the little town of Stephenville. And her husband is a doctor there in the clinic, and they like cross-country skiing and fly fishing and rafting, and they're right at a beautiful place. The next girl is a nurse, school nurse in Fort Worth. Her son is at A&M studying architecture, and her daughter's in graduate school at TCU. And the last boy is in insurance. He was in the Marine Corps, and he's in insurance in Florida. It's a young company, and he's working up. I think he'll finally be one of their officials. And he's a real hard-nosed kid, big. He's a couple inches taller than I am. And he was a fraud investigator in insurance for a long time, and so he can see through people that are making claims, illegal claims against insurance companies. And he's helping this company get started, and they're operating only in Florida now, but they will come on to other states. But he's doing pretty well out there, and one of his daughters is at A&M. We have 4 grandchildren at A&M.
Is there anything I've left out?
I don't think so. I think you did well.
I've covered. Well, I appreciate your time, Bill.
Well, thank you. Good.